Welcome to another episode of Tell Me More. Dr. Wiles and I are here in the studio talking about Ezra and Nehemiah, but also the timeline of the entire Old Testament because it can get a little bit complicated. Katie's on vacation and we miss her, but we're excited for her to be back tomorrow. Okay, well, Dr. Wiles and I are here, and we're just going to talk all things Ezra and Nehemiah. We don't have Katie with us. She's on vacation. Mm-hmm. But before we get to just the meat of today,
yes,
I feel like we have to point out that it is, at the time of this recording, Dr. Dennis Wiles' birthday.
That is exactly right.
He's 40 years young.
Yes.
Or however
old there you have it.
He'd like to tell you
But it is my birthday, which is awesome.
So if you're
3 days after Cindy.
3 days after Cindy.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
He was telling us the story. I don't know if you want to tell it on the podcast.
Yes, fine. We were born in the same hospital, delivered by the same doctor. We were in the nursery together for 2 days. And then our parents didn't know each other. And so she grew up mainly in Mississippi. We were born in Birmingham, Alabama, but her dad was an airplane pilot. So they moved to Mississippi, then ultimately to Atlanta when I met her. She was in Atlanta, Georgia, and we met in college when we were sophomores in college. But as I told y'all, I knew I'd seen her before when I met her. And but no, her mom put that story together for us. We didn't, obviously
Yeah, it'd be hard to connect those dots.
We didn't know. We had no clue. And her mom just asked me after I'd met them, now, where were you born? Birmingham. What hospital? Caraway Methodist. When were you born? When were you in the hospital? And she was like, we were in the hospital at the very same time. So there you have it. Her mom was a nurse, and she actually worked for the doctor that delivered us. So
wild.
Marriage made in heaven. That's what I'd say.
And we are thankful for both of you.
Well,
so happy belated birthday to Cindy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Happy birthday to you. I'm not going to, as my gift to you, I will not sing.
If Katie were here, she would sing.
She would sing. She would. I will not.
Okay.
But let's do one of your favorite things and let's talk about the Bible.
Let's do it.
So Sunday morning, you kind of walked through kind of a timeline of the Old Testament into the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So I thought we would kind of maybe do a deeper dive into that because I think people have a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. Not just people who haven't been to seminary. Even if you've been to seminary, I think there are times you hit those minor prophets and you go, when and who and where.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be good for us to piece all of that together again and kind of walk through that intertestamental period, some of the bizarre things that happened into the time of Jesus and into the early church, and maybe a little bit beyond, because I think it helps just contextualize all of this. So
it is the backdrop for it all.
It is the backdrop. And I think we get lost in the weeds. We forget that at one point the kingdom splits. We don't really know what to do with that, I think, as average readers of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So
it's confusing because you have Israel and Judah at the same time. And
one's good and it's not Israel.
Yeah. It's just you can get lost in it all, because you've got prophets and kings of both of them. And
well, and the books of the Bible are somewhat chronologically ordered, but we also have to remember that a lot of the prophets are actually being written alongside the events we read about in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And even those narrative books actually repeat stories, overlap, tell the same stories, but tell it different. They would, I think, maybe aptly fit the Mark Twain quote, tell the truth, but tell it slant. So they've got different perspectives on the same events.
That's right.
So
it's fascinating.
March through it all. So we have the Torah. Or the Pentateuch for your Septuagint self.
That's right.
Which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Correct.
5 books, Penta, 5.
Right.
So those, obviously, we tend to date the earliest.
Right. For the most part, yeah.
We were having this discussion. There's actually one book that some scholars say might predate all of those books. It's hard to say. There's not a lot of consensus, and that's Job. No one really knows where Job fits on a timeline.
I would probably agree with it being older, but...
Yeah, and that's because we don't find a lot of it. There's no reference within Job to any sort of sacrificial system, to Abraham, to the people of God. None of it. None of it's in there. So we think it probably predates even Genesis in terms of writing.
Yeah. I'd probably agree with that.
So then we have Joshua. They've come out, they're wandering the wilderness. Judges is a mess. When Judges is being written, we have Ruth. So those are contemporary books. And then I think after that, we all kind of go, what comes next?
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna pass the
Samuel,
baton.
maybe Samuel.
First and Second Samuel.
Yeah, that's probably what I'd say.
But there's some overlap there with First Chronicles.
Yeah, First Chronicles is weird how it fits in. It's kind of an interesting book. And so, yeah, but I would probably still do it that way and then shift over to the Kings and then come back to Second Chronicles,
Yeah.
And when you do that, you have done the Old Testament era almost.
You've almost got it all.
You've covered everything. So now you've got to go back and weave in
all the other.
Everybody else.
So like Psalms.
Yeah.
While we want to attribute that mostly to like King David's timeline, right. Psalm 90 is attributed to Moses.
Yeah.
And there are some Psalms that are attributed to the exilic period and the post-exilic period. Yeah. So Psalms actually spans.
It's very different. Yeah.
The whole thing. Proverbs is probably more closely tied to Solomon, and so is Ecclesiastes. Our best bets.
Yeah, I think that'd be true. But then you got all these prophets, and not only that, as you and I were talking earlier, you've got Israel after Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam takes over, and Solomon did all this building, and there's a whole lot we don't know actually, believe it or not, and so he does all this building. Well, the idea was that he had taxed the children of Israel, and Solomon is a southerner, so he's in Jerusalem. So the tribes to the north,
northerners and southerners just have issues.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And so you've got just the challenge of that relationship. And so the question was, when Solomon dies, is his son going to be more friendly toward the northern tribes? Is he going to give them more what I might call fair representation in making all these decisions and all these massive building efforts? Or is he going to continue to be like his dad? And so when Jeroboam and them representing those tribes asked Rehoboam, are you going to be like your dad? Are you going to be harder on us than your dad? And Rehoboam consults his counselors, and they tell him, you might want to be thoughtful about this. And instead, he just goes out and basically tells Jeroboam, if you think it was bad with my dad, it's only going to get worse. Kind of my paraphrase.
Great leadership tactic.
Yeah, exactly. Ignored the wise counselors. He was young and, impulsive, I would say. I don't think he realized, though, that the northern tribes would just leave.
And they did. And that's the 10 tribes in the north.
Yeah. So I don't think he realized that would happen, but that is exactly what happened. So now, and they call themselves Israel, because they presume to be the real Israel. And so the folks in the south become known as Judah. That's the most prominent tribe. Well, now all of a sudden you're going to have a king of Judah. Well, Israel's going to have a king too.
Yeah.
They want their own kings.
So you have two kings, a divided kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's why some people think we have First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles.
Right, yeah, which is confusing.
First Kings is probably written from a southern perspective. So a perspective that loves David, loves Solomon, and then the Chronicles are written from a northern perspective that think they're not the legitimate
it's just a
kingdom.
Yeah, it's a different presentation, telling almost the same stories, but from a different bent.
Again, Mark Twain. Tell the truth, but tell slant.
Yep. And then not only do you have kings, you've got prophets, and it's like you've got prophets who are going to live predominantly in the south. You're going to have prophets who are going to live predominantly in the north. And the span of history, kind of connecting to Kings and Chronicles is all woven in there together.
So if you're playing along at home, in the north, you get Amos and Hosea.
Right.
And then in the south, you get Joel, Micah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah.
Correct.
And
Jeremiah's kind of the doomsayer. Jeremiah's saying this thing's about to end. Yeah. So, to the south.
To the south.
Because the north's already done.
Yeah, the north is over at this point.
Yeah.
It's the Assyrians conquered them. The reason we call them the lost tribes, and this is, you've got to get really into ancient Near Eastern history here. The Assyrians, the way that they conquered people is they would typically kill all the men or sell them into slavery.
Yeah, whatever.
And then they would make the women marry into Assyrian marriages and basically just culturally erase the people.
Correct.
And so
kind of an odd form of genocide, but that's really almost what it was.
Yeah. So they would increase their population by conquering,
that's correct,
but culturally erase the entire people.
And polluting what the Jews would have considered the purity of their race, polluted.
Yeah.
And then leave many of them there in Samaria. And so they become these weird cousins of the Jews in the south because
by the time the New Testament comes, they are not friends. So the Samaritans are kind of the byproduct of this Assyrian method of conquering.
Right. Yeah. And so
in the south,
a lot of brokenness.
Jeremiah says it's coming to an end.
Right.
And then you got these 3 oddball prophets that we only ever read one of them very much in church, and that's Jonah.
That's right.
And then you have Nahum and Obadiah are prophets to foreign nations.
Right.
And that's all happening kind of concurrently in this First Samuel through 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles period. Mm-hmm. And then
interesting
exile.
Taken to Babylon.
And so you have Daniel and Ezekiel happen in exile. Mm-hmm. This is all Babylonian. Mm-hmm. And then, so the Babylonians got the southern tribes. The northern tribes are gone.
Right.
What happens to Babylon?
Mm-hmm. Conquered by the Persians.
Modern day Iran, Iraq.
Iranians and Iraq, yeah. And then you got this whole, when Cyrus, who's the king of Persia, takes over, he decides it's okay for people to live in their own lands, practice their own religion, and have some type of self-governance as long as it's connected to them, and which was pretty unusual for the ancient world. And so then he tells these captive Jews, you can go home. Well, some of them had fared really well.
Like Esther.
Yeah, fared really well. So, yeah, she's the queen. So a lot of them stay, but he does release some to go home, which they do. And they get back to Jerusalem. Well, then you have a whole other set of prophets. These are the ones who are trying to challenge the Jews to live properly in kind of the new land, so to speak, if you will. So
which we've got to remember, there's some people who, when the exile came, the Babylonians actually basically took like the elite classes of people with them.
Yeah.
So the lower classes, the basic laborers actually remained in the land, intermarried with other people. Mm-hmm. So when they show up, it's not empty. There are people there.
There are people living there, yes.
Semi-Jewish people living there, but they've intermarried.
And not every one of them welcoming.
No.
Because they've learned to live in their own somewhat level of independence. And so when Zerubbabel returns, and now it's his responsibility to rebuild the temple, well, there was some energy for it, but there were also others who felt like there was no need to do it. Yeah. So you get Haggai, the prophet, saying, well, y'all are all living in your paneled houses. This is from God. And what about God's house? You're all taking care of yourselves. So Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, these men speak into that post-exilic world, if you will. And so then you've got the return to Israel kind of in 3 stages, Zerubbabel, and then go about 100 years later and you get Ezra, and another 15 or so years later you get Nehemiah. And so you come to the end of Nehemiah, and now, you're 400 years before Christ. Yeah. And basically it's the end of 2 Chronicles. It's the end of the prophetic period with Malachi. It's the end of our understanding, at least our knowledge of the governance of these people with Nehemiah. And now you've got 400 years of intertestamental period.
And somehow Rome shows up on the scene.
And Jesus, yeah. And so 325, the Greeks take over the world. Alexander the Great takes the world over and Hellenizes the world. And basically,
which is a way of dominate, like enforcing language is a way of domination. It's a way of changing cultural perspective and changing the world. Yes. So it's a brilliant military tactic on Alexander's part, but he dies young.
He does die young, and what do you say? He believed that the Greek culture was superior. I guess I think that's his argument. And like you said, the language, now you've established these learning centers, these huge libraries, and next thing you know, everybody's speaking Greek. I mean, that's a little bit of exaggeration, but not too bad, not too much, because the
it at least became the language of trade.
Yeah,
so if you're out shopping,
how you were gonna do life, if you will. And if you couldn't speak Greek, they would make fun of people. They would say they sounded barbarous. Their language sounded weird, and so they became known as barbarians. That just meant they
sounded like they were saying bar.
They couldn't speak Greek, and so the Greeks take over, and it's really an incredible to me overtaking of so much of the culture. then eventually the Romans will take over. But
there's
in the
some stuff in
meanwhile,
between.
yeah, you've got the Jews are still struggling. Like I mentioned Sunday morning, they've got this spectrum, this tension of either accepting the fact that okay, they're in the middle of foreign rule, it is what it is, and then those who've got animosity toward the foreign rule, and there's tension there, and the decision: can we really govern ourselves? Can we overthrow these folks who have imposed their will upon us? And so, and one of the sermons Sunday morning, I said a brief word about the Maccabees, that there was a great revolt in Israel, and this Hasmoneans, this group of this family of leaders came together and basically just declared the independence of Israel.
Because when Alexander died, his kingdom got split into four pieces between his generals. A group called the Ptolemies out of Egypt ruled Israel. They're not very effective rulers.
Not quite as gifted as Alexander was.
And so that's when this kind of revolt happens, is under the Ptolemaic rule.
And
with a P.
It's kind of an interesting time, too, in history, because you've got all these Greeks living outside of Israel. All these Jews living outside of Israel. Well, they've all learned how to speak Greek because of Alexander. And so they can't really, they've lost touch with their heritage a little bit. And so during the Ptolemy reign, they finally decide we need to be able to read the Bible, and so they get a group of scholars together, as the story goes, 6 from each tribe, so you got 72 scribes, and translate the Torah into Greek, which if you think about it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, it was revolutionary.
Yeah.
It had only ever been written in Hebrew and a little bit in Aramaic.
Yeah, right. So, that was, I think back on that and look at how that laid the groundwork, though, for the New Testament church, kind of as an aside. But that was an incredible decision. And then the next thing you know, eventually all of the writings are going to be translated into Greek. So you've got all these Greek-speaking Jews who now can read the Bible for themselves for the first time. And it does become the lingua franca for the early church, because most of those early church Jews were Greek speakers. Many of them were. And so the Septuagint, as that book became known as, became their Bible. When I was in seminary, I did a class. It was a Hebrew and Greek class where we took all of the quotations. This is an aside, by the way.
It's a good aside.
But we took all of our assignment in the class was we had a Greek professor and a Hebrew professor who taught the class. And so we were divided into groups, and we took every Old Testament quotation in the New Testament and divided them up in our groups, and we had to report back in our seminar over the course of the year which text was being quoted by the New Testament writer.
Were they quoting the Hebrew?
Were they quoting the Hebrew or the Greek? And it's a fascinating study. And what you'll discover is many times they're quoting the Greek, the Septuagint. But there are times when they're obviously using the Hebrew because there's some discrepancies translation-wise. But that whole thing happens. Well, nobody tolerates insurrection for very long.
No, but you do have a revolt. So a group of Jews take over. And for those listening, you may be wondering, okay, what is this about?
Right.
So there's a very famous Jewish holiday called Hanukkah. And I think the average Christian goes back and reads the Old Testament and goes, Hanukkah's not in the Bible.
Where is Hanukkah?
Where does Hanukkah come from? And it actually comes from this period of revolt.
Right. This intertestamental period, and becomes a special time where, they have the miracle of enough oil, and they're able to keep the menorah lit for 8 days or whatever it was. And but eventually that's going to be squelched, as you know, that revolt will be put down, and finally, Pompey will just take over that part of the world on behalf of the Romans. And what was fascinating, though, even
Pompeii is a person, not the volcano.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Pompey the general. I'm sorry, the General Pompey. Julius Caesar's rival, best friend, whatever. But what's interesting to me, Luke, about that time is that for whatever reason, the Romans decided Judah could practice freedom of religion. It's really fascinating to me when you look back on some of these decisions these ancient pagan kings made.
Wild for the time.
Yes, because the Romans were so superstitious about their gods and all of that. But for some reason, they decided Judah could practice their own religion, and Jews were free to do whatever they wanted to do.
Which it would have been Judah at this point, not Israel. No one's calling it Israel.
Nobody used the word Israel, and they actually were called Judeans, these people who lived there, which I kind of like that word, to be honest with you, Judeans. To me, that kind of speaks to that first century milieu, or that, that early Roman era in the history of Israel. But eventually the Romans are going to allow them to somewhat be locally governed as long as they'll pay their taxes.
They're very, very high taxes.
Yeah, stay at peace with Rome. And so, then eventually you're going to get the King Herod, who is is a wicked person in a lot of ways, but a very effective ruler and very much in relationship with Rome. And he is able to bring the peace and settle the hearts of the Jews. He understood where he was. So one of the things he did was he continued to refurbish the Jewish temple. He knew that was the heart of the people.
And this would have been the temple that got built under Zerubbabel.
That's right. So the temple that goes back to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the temple that Herod will kind of expand and actually build to its greatest extent, if you will. And so by the time you get to the first century, you've made your way through just this massive story of upheaval and change and foreign rulers and, local kings and a divided kingdom and prophets and the people of God being exiled, the people of God being returned. And then I think all of that's in the water, though, that creates such messianic fervor around the first century. Because I think that the Jews who were then left in Israel just believed that God had had enough and that it was time for God to send the person who was actually going to just rescue them from all of this and break every chain, if you will. And so there was messianic fervor, I think, that existed in that era that's probably unprecedented in Jewish history, Yeah,
and sometimes you'll hear historians call that period Second Temple Judaism, and so that's because it's the Second Temple.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fascinating time of history. I mean, to me, it can be very confusing when you try to piece it all together, but I hope that what we've done today at least puts it in context. So if you think about, if you go back to the time of Rehoboam, like 925-ish BC, and so Israel now divides, and the tribes to the north, the tribes to the south, Israel and Judah. And they've got their own kings. And then in 722 BC, the Assyrians attack the north, do what you said, just, kill a lot of the men. And then the next thing you know, the people who live in that part of what would have been known as Israel are actually polluted by that Assyrian blood. So it's just a mixture of races. Which
are really violent people.
Yeah, just awful, really. And pagan worship practices, everything that would have been an abomination to the people of God, like all that's just happening right in front of you. Yeah, everything
horrible
you can think
things.
Of. And so now you've got just this tiny country left, and they're surrounded. The Egyptians to the south of them, you got the Assyrians to the north of them. You got Babylon rising up to the kind of the northwest of them, and then the next thing the Babylonians take the whole thing over, and destroy the Assyrians. And for whatever reason, they were able to Judah, the country in the south, for 200 years was able to navigate its relationship with the Assyrians. It's quite fascinating, really. But Nebuchadnezzar had enough, so Nebuchadnezzar decided all of it belonged to him. So 587 BC, he takes over Judah.
Basically takes out all the intellectuals.
Yes, just
all the upper cat.
Empties it of its future, is what I would say, really. And so people like Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, these are the kind of folks he takes back to Babylon, plunders the temple. I mean, can you imagine these people who can't even walk on the temple grounds unless they have prepared themselves for, you know what I mean? You certainly couldn't go into the temple treasury.
No.
I mean, you talking about holy property, and a pagan army comes in and destroys it and empties it of its treasure. It takes the treasure of David, if you will, and transports it off to a pagan nation. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have felt like to the Jews.
They're not just hanging their harps by the side of the river and crying because they're sad.
Right.
They feel bad.
That's right. Yeah. It's absolute devastation. It's ripping the heart out of who they are. And it basically is, to me, it was a destruction of their future. Because their future to them was in that next generation of leaders in Jerusalem with the temple in place,
Which makes a passage like Jeremiah 29 just even more bold
absolutely,
and outrageous. Like I think we read it and it's like, oh, this is nice.
Yeah, no, I have the plans. I have the plans.
Plant gardens, keep your kids away in marriage, build houses.
That's right.
But in the context of your future's been robbed.
Right.
What a bold, outrageous prophecy that is.
Exactly. And so think about how they must have felt. And then the Persians emerge on the scene, and Cyrus was this incredible leader, truly gifted, I would say. And then he conquers the Babylonians and institutes a whole different way of ruling over people and allows these people, tells them you can go home. And by the way, he gives instruction to his people, go get all that plunder and give it back to these people and let them take that home. I mean, what a remarkable turn of events. And then to say to them, now go build your sanctuary. Here, I'll make sure you got resources. If you need the cedars of Lebanon or if you need whatever, just here's your bill of lading, so to speak, with a blank check. Get what you need and let's rebuild this thing and go practice your faith. And so these people get to return home and begin the process of rebuilding just the nation itself and pouring themselves into their future and restoring everything that was precious to them. And so with Zerubbabel and later it'll be Ezra and Nehemiah, you're going to have Judah restored in a new way. Granted, they don't really have an army per se. They had, Nehemiah had somewhat of an army, but it was no match for the Persians. They all knew that. And they had no king. And so they build the wall around Jerusalem. Ezra establishes this whole scribal community, we would probably say. And so now you've got the Torah is put back in place, and the practices of worship are now restored, and the place of worship is restored. And now the stage is set for that intertestamental period and ultimately the Messiah. So it's a crucial period in history for me.
Yeah, which Zerubbabel is in the lineage of Christ.
Yes, yeah. And so you've got that kingly line. You've got the line of Judah is in place. And so the stage is getting set. When so many of the things when we read the New Testament, we read them and we just, okay, this is true. We almost take it for granted. You got the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, all those things came into being during this era. You got the animosity toward the Samaritans. Well, this all came into being during this era. I mean, all that's in the backdrop.
They're not just mad for no reason.
That's right. And so, and even the Samaritans, when Nehemiah is there trying to rebuild the wall, the Samaritans are trying to stop them from doing it. They don't want Jews there. They don't want Judah to be repopulated like that. They want to still be in power in that part of the world. And now they've got the backing of these Persian kings. And so it was somewhat of a threat to them. So, yeah, there are a whole lot of seeds being planted during this time that are going to bear fruit during the time of Jesus. It helps us understand the first century to me so much better. But there also in this text in Ezra and Nehemiah, to me, there are these principles that I would look at when it comes to rebuilding, when it comes to turning your face toward the future, because that's exactly what's happening right in front of us. That's a little bit confusing when you read Ezra because you get Ezra 1, 2, and 3, whatever, and then all of a sudden you fast forward in time for just a little bit, and then you go back, and then you get Ezra 7, and now you're ahead 100 years. And so, that's why it's a little confusing because as you know, in the Hebrew Bible, this is just one book, Ezra and Nehemiah. When it ends up being translated into Greek, well, it depends on the version you look at. It can be 4 books, and you've got Esdras is now written into the script, and Esdras A and Esdras B and Ezra, and then eventually the latter part of the book called Nehemiah. And so as it makes its way into the Protestant Bible, it's just divided into these 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah, even though Ezra, the first few chapters are about Zerubbabel, not really about Ezra, but regardless, he's the principal character for the rest of it. But you've got just this journey of just facing the future with hope, kind of coming out of the rubble of everything that's happened. And I can only imagine how overwhelming it was for them to even think it was possible, and even if you rebuilt it, I guess part of my question would be for them is I wonder how secure they felt in it, because when they were rebuilding, they weren't really rebuilding the nation in the sense that, you're going to have King David and King Solomon again with these massive armies and the growth of the land and all that.
You're not a rich nation under Solomon anymore.
Exactly. That's not really there. And so even if you rebuild the temple, it's been destroyed before by a pagan army. You've lost your brothers to the north of you to another pagan army. And you've got enemies kind of all around you, with in Syria and in Samaria. And so, okay, sure, there was a celebration of rebuilding the temple. But even when they rebuilt the temple, some of the older ones said, yeah, but it's not the Temple of Solomon though. It's smaller. It's not what our forefathers had. And there's no wall around the city. So
what's to stop anyone from doing it again?
I mean, and we don't really have any way to protect ourselves, and there's nobody to govern us. So it was a very uncertain, vulnerable time in the history of these people. And so that's why it is a fascinating journey to me. And then watching them make decisions really toward the future that might not necessarily be as beneficial to them per se, but they were building for something beyond themselves. And in so doing, they found a life for themselves. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I want us to go this fall, is to be thinking about those kinds of things in our own lives, in our churches. You and I, we're part of this engagement team, and we've had conversations about what's happened to our churches. I mean, and I know people are tired of talking about the pandemic, but I can't help but talk about it because the research is just now coming out. It takes a while to start measuring things. You can't just say, oh, yeah, well, that happened. Yeah, we're over it. Well, are we? I mean, so much has changed, since then,
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like when 9/11 happened. You look back on it like you, Addison, sitting there behind the camera, as young as y'all are. I remember when you used to walk in the airport, and if I was coming to pick you up in the airport and you were flying in from wherever, I would just walk all the way to the gate. Nobody ever said anything to me. I didn't have to be inspected. I didn't have to have a ticket.
You didn't have to take your shoes off.
Nobody knew anything. I just went back there and sat down with you. And if I wanted to, I could walk over here and just sit down and smoke a cigarette with my friends. I mean, I didn't smoke, but I'm just saying, people are all just sitting around smoking in the airport.
Smoking sections.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? They're sitting around smoking and having a cocktail, and nobody has checked them. I mean, nothing. They're just waiting on their wife or their husband or their family to come to the gate. I mean, 9/11 happens. Well, think about the airport now. The airport y'all know is so different than the one I knew.
I flew before 9/11.
Okay, so now, think about it. If you show up at the airport and say, hey, my wife's coming in, and I don't know if she knows where she's going. I think I'm just going to run to the gate to meet her. Well, actually, no, you're not. No,
you're going to drive in a loop.
Yeah, that's what you're going to do. You might as well let him get out of your car, So it changed everything, and now we just kind of live with it. I get it. Well, the pandemic has changed so much. It's affected our churches. And we're just now coming to grips with what really has happened. So things like worship attendance patterns have so drastically changed. And we've come so much more adept at doing things like this. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not that we weren't doing some things, electronically and online and all that, but it was nothing like it is today. There's this digital footprint that we all now talk about and desire. That's a big part of who we are now. And even the way people choose to give, the way they choose to now live in community. And I think, was it Putnam, whoever wrote the book in the early 2000s about bowling
alone is from the year 2000.
Something like that. Well, now that's kind of become a catchphrase for sociologists who are saying, well, that wasn't just this guy's view. That's kind of what's happening to us. People are eating alone. They're shopping from at home now. They don't even go to the grocery store. And in other words, the things that you used to have to go do, well, people aren't doing that. And when the pandemic put that on steroids, where not only no longer you have to do it, there are many people now who have no desire to do it. Yeah. And so you've created this whole isolation phenomenon. And we've talked on here before about loneliness and what's crept into kind of our
Center
society.
for Disease Control has actually started labeling it an epidemic.
Yeah. So, and like we were talking a couple of weeks ago when we were having this conversation in our staff meeting about flourishing, how the current Surgeon General has put this whole research document out about loneliness, and that it is an epidemic, and we've got to do something about it. He's even calling on people like us to address it, want to know where are all the faith communities, and so how it's affected us. And I would say that we're kind of in a season of rebuilding, of rethinking things, Just for example, here's a very practical thing. I can remember a time when we took Wednesday nights at First Baptist Arlington for granted. We didn't even really give it a whole lot of thought. We had programmed it at a certain level, and it's just what everybody did. They came up here, they ate, they went to choir rehearsal, they went to Bible study, they went to RAs, they went to GAs. It's just, you went to youth worship. It's just if you were in this church and you were a part of the core of this church, you didn't even think about it. You went to children's choirs, youth choir. It's just kind of what we did. Dude,
we're working hard to bring it back.
I was going to say, everything changes. Then you go through the pandemic and you're like, so you're talking to pastor friends. Well, what do y'all do on Wednesday nights? And I made that point Sunday morning. Most every pastor goes, well, used to. Yeah, used to. We did this. We used to. We did that. And it's like, wow, it's fascinating. And so now we're rebirthing Wednesday nights this very week in a very different way that has required so much intentionality. Think about all the meetings our staff has had.
Had a few.
Behind the scenes, just trying, okay, well, what if we try that? I don't think so. I don't know that. You got parents that are busy, kids, schools. And it's like there's just this array of things that used to we never even worried about. I don't ever remember talking about them. It was just assumed, this is what you do on a Wednesday night. Well, guess what? That's just not how it is anymore. So now it seems to me that to me is a small example of what we're doing and what you and I and all of us are doing up here. It's so much more intentional now, and a lot more thought is given to it. I'm not saying that our forebears didn't do all that. I'm just saying that once they got it in place, we just lived with it, and now that's just not how it is. It's so much more challenging. And, but at the same time, I'm actually energized by it. I think we're in a season of rebuilding, and we're recrafting, we're rethinking things that we do and how we interact with lost people and what's happened in our community. But then also this fall, what I want us to think about is us putting that in place in our own lives. As people are going through things in their own lives where now it's time to have to assess, how do I rebuild this part of my life? What does that mean to me? So this sermon series to me, it has a pastoral feel to it, I guess is what I would say. It's going to be a journey for me to walk through some of the things that I believe the Lord has revealed to me about that phase in our lives. And Ezra and Nehemiah offer the principles and kind of the context for the conversation. So,
I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah. So, we'll see. So this past Sunday, I like the idea of encouraging people to think about the big things first. Just anchor yourself in what you know to be true. That to me is a great place to start, and lean into those things that you know to be true. Then we'll figure out how to get you aimed toward the future. We'll figure out how to help you find your way. Church is the same way, but getting anchored first, I believe I think that's the first thing to do. So I'm excited about it. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm too. It's going to be a fun series. It's going to be an important series.
Yeah.
So, happy birthday. What are you doing for your birthday dinner?
Well, actually, I have a personnel committee meeting tonight. So
I do too.
You're going to come with me. You want to come with me?
Sure.
And but what I did last night, though, we wanted to take our whole family, the ones that were able to go to the Rangers game. So we did that. Our little grandson, Gideon, his very first Rangers game.
Saw the picture. Super cute.
So cute. And we had some friends who were here from West Africa, never been to a baseball game. And then what's funny is when you take someone like that who knows nothing, and I love baseball, and it just reminded me of how complex baseball is when you're, like if I had taken them to a soccer game.
It's very hard to explain baseball to people.
It is, and I'm not a big soccer fan, but I understand why it is so prevalent. You go to a soccer game, you can kind of figure out. Now, there's a whole lot to it, and I get that. But I'm just saying, kick that ball through that goal. Okay, I got it. Now, you're trying to stop me. I understand that. You go to a baseball game, and and they're like, well, what just happened? Well, see, the thing is, okay, he hit the ball, but the guy caught it, but it had already bounced on the ground. So that's why he had to throw it to this base. So if he'd have caught it in the air, it's been okay. And they're like, oh, okay. And I'm thinking, this is going to take a little while,
I think if you live in the United States, you forget just how weird United States culture is,
it can
and
be,
all of the things that go with
it. It's very complicated. Baseball was a great microcosm of that, because I'm trying to explain, well, if you catch in the air, then that guy has to go sit down. Oh, okay, I got it. But if it bounces, well, then he can still keep running. Oh, okay. But if they throw the ball there to that base before he gets to it, well, then he has to go sit down. Oh, okay. And then all of a sudden they all go sit down, and they're looking at me going, where are they all going? I said, well,
it's the other team's turn.
That's right. So it was fun.
Oh,
anyway.
Well, I'm glad. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And everyone, thanks for listening. We hope it's been very good for you, and we're excited to see where the series goes.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Tell Me More podcast today. You can subscribe to this podcast on your app of choice, or you can visit us at fbca.org to find out more information about the podcast and our church. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.